Chapter 24, Nationalism. When World War I was going on and after it was over, the peoples in Africa and the Far East who had been conquered by European nations began to think that, hey, Europe is vulnerable, Europe is weak, and maybe we can get our independence. They resented, among other things, that even the upper classes of them were given menial government jobs, were treated like second-class citizens, and a lot of your clubs were white-only clubs. Country club, golf club, only allowed Europeans in. Same thing even for science clubs or other political clubs, only white-skinned people were allowed. The intellectuals among the colonial peoples sometimes had a mixed attitude toward the Europeans. They admired the Europeans' technological achievements, admired their seemingly more even distribution of wealth, but at the same time they hated, resented the way that Europeans were trying to get them to change their way of thinking. Particularly, a lot of them resented the fact that it seemed like Europeans were trying to Christianize them against their will, and were looking down on them for, well, your book mentions the Buddhist traditions, among others, but local traditions were often frowned upon, scorned, or just outright trod over. And a lot of the local peoples resented it. Religion played a role. Some of the conquered peoples in Asia and Africa wanted to keep their old traditional religions and keep them intact, and others wanted to move on and adopt more Western ways. And in short, they wanted their independence. The time period we're talking about is from 1919 to 1939, the period between the two world wars. Now, these nations, for the most part, in fact, actually practically all of them, got their independence after World War II. That is, the ones that wanted their independence. After World War II, there was just a mass exodus from colonialism. The United States gave up the Philippines. Puerto Rico stayed with us by its choice. But the United States gave up the Philippines. Britain gave up Jamaica. Belgium gave up the Congo. And France gave up Algeria. The Vietnamese whipped the French in Vietnam. And then they turned around and whipped the United States also. But these nations began to think about ways to assert themselves. One of the more famous of the figures was Gandhi, sometimes known as Mohandas or Great Soul. Gandhi began to preach a doctrine of passive resistance. In other words, he simply told the people of India, let's just simply disobey British laws, but not engage in violence. So we don't want a war, we don't want bloodshed, we want to do this peacefully. Now, keep in mind, the whole world at this time was gripped with you might say, an idea of pacifism. Albert Einstein wrote a book entitled Why War?, trying to convince the world that war was wrong. Religious groups of various persuasions were trying to tell the world, hey, we don't need another war. We just had a big war, and war is just too devastating these days, so we have to find ways to work through our problems peacefully. So Gandhi was in tune with the world at the time in his call for pacifism. Your book opens up in the opening vignette showing Gandhi in his traditional Indian habit, traditional Indian clothes, in other words, on his march to the sea. The backdrop for this was the British government had passed a law that only British industrialists were allowed to mine salt, and the people of India had to buy the salt that was put out by the British industrialists. And the people of India were not allowed to mine their own salt, were not allowed to process their own salt. Now, if you think this is unfair, so does the rest of the world now. But at the time, for the British people, it seemed like the thing to do. After all, it said, we're your overlords, we're your conquerors, and we want to get all the profits from salt. So the British did not allow the people of India to mine their own salt or process their own salt. Gandhi says, we're going to disobey the law. So he led a long march to the sea, and he scooped up from the ocean side some salt and had his followers do the same, simply letting the British government know we're not going to obey your laws. There was a clash between the British and the Indians. Several hundred Indian people were killed, and Gandhi himself was arrested. Gandhi spent several years in prison. When he got out of prison, he continued encouraging his people to resist British rule and to passively refuse to obey. Now, Gandhi was largely a traditionalist. You can tell by his dress he wanted the people of India to go back to the old ways. Yes?
How long was he in jail?
How much?
How long was he in jail?
I don't know how long. It seemed like it was a few years. I'm not even sure your book even mentions how long, but it was a while. I don't see it here. Just don't worry about it. It seemed like it was a few years, though. Anyway, he kept encouraging resistance. So yes, well, yeah. He was a traditionalist. His favorite tool was the spinning wheel. He told the women of India, we want you to go back to spinning yarn the old-fashioned way, the way your ancestors did for centuries. Spin your wool, spin your yarn into, the old way, and don't buy British clothing that had been made with power looms and been made with their machinery. We don't want any of that here. We want to return India to the way it was in time past. All right. However, even Gandhi knew that there were certain things about India that was going to have to change. The untouchables, for instance. He realized that the untouchables was a blot on the character of the Indian nation, and that something should be done to integrate the untouchables, that is the pariahs or the outcasts, the low people of India, and something should be done to integrate them into Indian society. He also was against the practice of sati, where that women would throw themselves in a fire and burn themselves when their husbands died. And he was against child marriages. Again, he knew that these practices met with the disapproval of the outside world, and some things then had to change. But otherwise, he wanted India to go back to its old way of living, which he thought was simpler, more fulfilling, with a lot less humdrum. He met a man named Nehru, who was in a lot of ways Gandhi's opposite. Nehru said, oh yes, we got to change, bring India up to the modern world. We not only need to change the plight of the untouchables, or in the practice of sati, or in the practice of child marriages, at least 3 issues your book mentions that kept India apart from the rest of the world. But Nehru said, we need to copy Western ways. We need to learn how to make automobiles, make airplanes, and build radios. We need to get radios and refrigerators in every Indian home. We need to copy Western styles and Western ways. Gandhi and he disagreed on that, but they did agree on one thing, and that kept them together as long as Gandhi lived. They did agree that the British had to go. Now, in 1982, there was a movie made about Gandhi, and your book makes a reference to it on top of page 700. in 1985, I rented this same movie and watched it twice. The movie depicts one question they would continually ask Gandhi that Gandhi didn't answer. The British said to him, now, okay, you want your independence, but you have a problem. In the northern part of your country, the people there are mostly Muslim. In the southern part of your country, the people are mostly Hindu. And the only thing that had kept the Muslims and Hindus apart was the presence of the British. It's known that if the British hadn't been there, they'd fight each other. So they asked Gandhi, now, what will you do? How will you solve the problem of the Muslim majority in the northern part of your country? And in the movie, Gandhi would tell the British ambassador, oh, let us handle it, we'll find a way, we'll take care of it. That did not satisfy the British. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. When the British finally gave Gandhi's India their independence, the British actually created two nations. They created a nation to the north, which they called Pakistan, which means land of the pure. You see this word, this stand on the map, that's another translation for land. I mean, you have in the western part of the world, England, Ireland, Iceland, Finland, Greenland. And in this part of the world, you have all the stands, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Turkestan, Uzbekistan, whatever. Anyway, in this case, it means land of the pure. Anyway, the British government said that the Pakistanis, you go form your own country. And then to the Hindus, you go form your country. And folks, this led to a conflict that's lasted this day. The two groups hate each other. Now, on a personal note, Lockheed made a habit of hiring people from those countries. And one year, 1982, they hired a man from Pakistan and another man from India. And at first they hated each other, but then they realized, hey, we have more in common here among ourselves than we have with anybody else here at this factory, anybody else in this town. So they finally became fast friends. And remained so because they were more alike than either one of them was like the Americans who they were living among. Anyway, I guess one point I'm going to make is a point I've always made. Pacifism, in one word, leads to war. Always has. And this case was no exception. The Pakistanis and Indians got involved in a big warfare that has cost thousands of lives and still is going on, and each side accuses the other of sending their terroristic people in to commit suicide bombings or engage in other acts of terror. They basically still hate each other. Now, shortly after Gandhi died, a very famous American was to copy Gandhi. Anybody know who I'm talking about?
MLK.
Who?
MLK.
MLK, Martin Luther King. Yeah, he copied Gandhi. And again, like Gandhi, Martin Luther King had a grievance, a justifiable grievance. And on a personal note, my wife is a big admirer of King's, and we have visited King's Center and taken our children to King's Center and told him what his grievances were. But I want to insert, folk, even though Martin Luther King, like Gandhi, preached nonviolence, some of you may know almost every word he went, violence followed. I'm not saying it was his fault. The changes he wanted to make could not come about without some rioting and bloodshed. Do I enjoy saying what I'm saying? Not at all. But it's simply a fact of life. Some people cannot be changed by mere persuasion, no matter how on the wrong side they are. Again, both men experienced violence in their time. Now, in the case of Gandhi, I had a student who is from India tell me that Gandhi was hard against fighting a war with Pakistan. Nevertheless, he could not prevent it. The hatred between both sides was so great, and the people of India really wanted their country united. They wanted the Pakistani territory, and they moved in over Gandhi's objection. But there was still a Big problem. All right. Want to go to Iran, and then we'll quit for the day. No, wait, not Iran. Pardon me, Turkey. The story of Turkey during this time revolves around a man named Ataturk. When the Ottoman Empire faded out of existence and saw it could not hold itself together, a bunch of Christians living in the region moved in and said, we want to restore the old Byzantine Empire, and with some help from France or Britain, they might have done it. But Ataturk stepped in. He was a Muslim, and he was determined that the Muslims would not lose his territory, but he realized that he had to make some changes. Turkey had been known for 100 years as the sick man of Europe. So he made some sweeping changes that are still in force to this day. Among the reforms he made, he commanded that no Turkish man was allowed to wear the fez. In other words, a Turkish hat. Here was the problem he had with the fez. The law had said that only Muslims were allowed to wear it, and Christians and Jews were not allowed. He said, I want to be able to go down the streets or ride through my country and not be able to tell the difference between a Jew, a Christian, or a Muslim. He forbade the Muslim women from wearing veils. Again, only Muslim women have been allowed to wear veils. He said, I want everybody in my country to be dressed alike, and I want to not be able to tell what faith you are. He passed a law that said that anybody could convert from one religion to another. Now, it had always been legal to convert from any other religion to Islam. But he made it to where you can convert from, do you have a comment? No. He made a law that you could convert even from Islam to Christianity. Now, I say that with a grain of salt because I know that a lot of Islamic people who converted were in fact killed, not by the government, but by other persons. He elevated the status of women. Again, this was because all of Europe was doing it at the time, even the United States. He even gave women the right to vote, and some women were allowed to hold office. The offices were generally menial, but he elevated the status of women. And all told, he began to convince the Turkish people that, hey, we can become a secular state just like the European states are. So he tried to make Turkey into a secular state, which is very difficult to do with a Muslim country, but he somewhat succeeded. Now, in the year 2000, we had a situation that very few people see. We had the end of a millennium, the end of a century, and the end of a decade, all three. And they got together and said, let's decide who are some of the greatest people who lived in the last 100 years, who are the greatest people who lived in the last 1,000 years, and who are the greatest people who lived in the last 10 years. This man was one near the top of the several lists, not only on the 100-year list, but even on the 1,000-year list. A lot of people, particularly outside his country, liked his reforms. And even inside his own country, a lot of the Turkish people realized that if Turkey was to get any respect, they were going to have to be more like their neighbors. Today, Turkey is a member of NATO and generally a friend of the West, and for the most part hasn't come into conflict with most of their Western neighbors. Among other things, he tried to make his country capitalistic. He moved the capital from Constantinople to Ankara, which is still the capital today. Now, he had a lot of success in what he did. Unfortunately, in Iran, a family took over the Iranian government and tried to modernize Iran the same way, tried to westernize and secularize Iran, and it did so for a while. But in Iran, it didn't work. Maybe it was the geography. Iran is located right smack in the midst of the Muslim world. But in Iran, it worked for a while. Then in 1979 came the Iranian Revolution, where they overthrew the last of the Shahs. and set up a government of clerics, and were determined that Iran was going to become a very, very, very Muslim state, and undid the reforms of the previous dynasty. When I think of Iran, I can't help but remember Joseph II of Austria, who tried to make all kinds of reforms and failed. Sometimes you can change and sometimes you can't. Turkey seemed to have changed pretty well. Iran, the changes lasted for a little while, but inevitably they, I don't want to use the word inevitably, but they just simply did not last. And fast forward to 2014, Iran is one of the United States' biggest enemies. At one time, 30 years ago, they were the best friend we had in the Middle East. Unfortunately, well, the reason they're our enemies is we helped keep the Shah in power while he was engaging in torture and brutality. And we helped keep him in power, and now they hate us for it. Look, I got permission from my sisters to tell this, so if I've told it already, I'm sorry, but when I was 18 years old, my two younger sisters got involved in a fight, one of them age 10 and one of them age 8. Well, the 10-year-old was getting the best of the 8-year-old, so I thought, hey, I'm going to intervene on behalf of the younger one. You can guess what happened. Both of the girls started pounding on me. What does this have to do with a lesson? Actually, it has everything. We go into Afghanistan and make all sides mad at us. Go into Iran and make everybody there mad at us. It's actually a